belt, his badge gleaming under the street lamp. To him, it was just another routine stop, until the man behind the wheel stepped out. The moment Reynolds saw the tall, confident figure in uniform, his smirk faltered. This wasn't just any black man. This was Sheriff David Carter. Reynolds had spent years throwing his weight around, using his badge as a shield for his prejudice. But tonight, he had messed with the wrong one. His voice dripped with hostility as he barked orders, his tone laced with disrespect. Sheriff Carter, calm and composed, asked a simple question. "Is there a problem, officer?" But Reynolds wasn't interested in answers. Fueled by arrogance, he made a move that would change everything, one he would regret in an instant. What happened next sent shockwaves through the department. A moment of power abuse turned into a lesson in consequences. And when the dust settled, the man who thought he was in control found himself facing something he never expected, a man who fought back. Sheriff Carter stood firm, his eyes locked on Reynolds, who was still gripping his baton a little too tight. The streetlight above them flickered, casting long shadows across the road. Carter had seen men like Reynolds before, officers who thought their badge gave them the right to intimidate, to control. But what Reynolds didn't know was that Carter had earned his badge the hard way. He had worked his way up, facing obstacles at every turn, proving himself in ways others never had to. Reynolds, still caught up in his own authority, squared his shoulders. "I don't care who you are," he sneered. "Step back." But Carter didn't move. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to shake the deputy's confidence. The silence between them grew heavier, charged with an unspoken challenge. Reynolds had expected fear. He had expected obedience. What he got instead was a man who wasn't afraid to meet him head-on. And that realization only made him angrier. He took a step closer, his hand twitching. But Carter knew something Reynolds didn't. Power wasn't about force. It was about control. And right now, Reynolds was losing his. The real question was, how far would he go? Reynolds' fingers twitched at his side, his breathing shallow as he tried to regain control of the situation. But control had already slipped through his grasp. The look in Sheriff Carter's eyes wasn't one of fear. It was something else, something steady, unshaken. That only fueled Reynolds' frustration. He had spent years making sure people like Carter knew their place. But now, standing in front of a man who outranked him, who held more authority than he ever would, the reality of his actions started to sink in. A few feet away, the dashboard camera in Reynolds' cruiser blinked red, silently recording every second. He hadn't thought twice before pulling Carter over. Maybe he had expected an easy target, someone who would take the disrespect and move on. But Carter wasn't that man. He had spent his entire career dealing with officers like Reynolds, men who let the badge get to their heads, who mistook their position for unchecked power. Inside the car, Carter's radio crackled. Dispatch was waiting for his response. If he wanted to, he could end this right now. He could report Reynolds, put an end to his reckless behavior with just a few words. But Carter also knew the system all too well. Exposing men like Reynolds wasn't always enough. Some got warnings, some got desk duty, and some, no matter how wrong they were, managed to slip through the cracks. Reynolds shifted his weight, the tension thick in the air. He knew he was being watched. Maybe for the first time in his career, he wasn't the one holding all the cards. But that didn't mean he was ready to back down. His jaw tightened, and his hand inched toward his radio. But whether he was calling for backup or trying to cover his own tracks, Carter wasn't sure. One thing was clear, this wasn't over. The radio crackled again, the sound cutting through the heavy silence between them. Carter could feel the weight of the moment pressing down. Every second that passed only made it clearer. Reynolds was at a breaking point. His authority had been challenged, and men like him didn't handle that well. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitching near his belt, but Carter saw something else too. Doubt. A flicker of hesitation in Reynolds' eyes, like he was realizing just how deep he'd stepped into this. Carter had seen this before. He knew that men like Reynolds thrived on control, and when they lost it, things got unpredictable. He could almost hear the wheels turning in Reynolds' head. How could he spin this? How could he twist the situation to make himself the victim? But Carter wasn't backing down. He wasn't letting this slide. A slow, tense moment passed before Carter finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Think carefully about your next move, Deputy." Reynolds' fingers hovered near his radio, his breathing sharp. He could call for backup, try to flip the story before it even started. But the blinking red light on the dashboard camera said otherwise. It had captured everything. The aggression, the threats, the moment Reynolds overstepped. If anyone saw that footage, there would be no spinning this. But Carter knew something Reynolds didn't. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about a system that protected men like him. A system that would find every excuse to make sure Reynolds walked away from this unharmed. The real question wasn't whether Reynolds would try to save himself. It was how far he was willing to go to do it. Then, without warning, Reynolds made his choice. Reynolds' hand shot to his radio, his voice sharp as he barked into the receiver. "Officer needs assistance. Suspect is aggressive." Carter's eyes narrowed. There it was. The twist, the lie. He had seen it play out too many times before. The truth didn't matter when the right words were said with the right tone. And now, within minutes, backup would arrive, expecting to find a dangerous suspect instead of a sheriff standing his ground. The tension between them thickened, but before Carter could respond, another voice crackled through Reynolds' radio. "Confirm suspect description." The dispatcher sounded unsure, like something wasn't adding up. Maybe they had already recognized Carter's voice from previous calls. Maybe they were hesitating. But Reynolds wasn't backing down. Blackmail, refusing orders, escalating. His words were cut off as Carter took a step forward. He didn't reach for anything, didn't move aggressively, but his presence alone was enough to send a wave of uncertainty through Reynolds. Then another twist. Carter's own radio buzzed. A familiar voice. "Sheriff Carter, we got a call. Do you need assistance?" His deputies, his people, they were listening. They were coming. Reynolds' face went pale as the realization hit. He had assumed he was the only one with control, but now the situation had shifted. Two sets of officers were on their way, one expecting trouble, the other knowing the truth. And when they arrived, someone was going to have to answer for what really happened here. The question now wasn't just whether Reynolds had made the wrong call. It was whether he had just set himself up for a reckoning he couldn't escape. Flashing lights painted the dark road in streaks of red and blue as sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Reynolds stiffened, his hand still gripping his radio, his mind racing. He had counted on backup arriving and taking his word without question. But now, with Sheriff Carter's deputies responding as well, the certainty he had clung to was slipping fast. The first patrol car screeched to a stop, doors swinging open as two officers stepped out. Carter recognized them immediately, seasoned men who had worked alongside him for years. Their eyes flicked between him and Reynolds, confusion flickering across their faces. Then another set of headlights cut through the darkness. Reynolds' backup. Two more officers emerged, hands hovering near their belts, waiting for a cue. For a moment, no one spoke. The scene was frozen in time, both sides unsure of what they had walked into. Then Carter broke the silence. "Everything's on that dash cam," he said, his voice even, controlled. Every word, every move. His words weren't just for Reynolds. They were for everyone standing there watching. Reynolds' face twisted, his confidence unraveling. He had played this game before, but never against someone who knew the rules better than him. The second officers hesitated now, doubt creeping in. They had responded to his call, but had he told them the whole truth? Then the unexpected happened. The radio crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't dispatch. It was a voice from the department, one that made Reynolds' entire body go rigid. "This is the sheriff's office. We have received footage from the patrol unit. Stand down." Carter's deputies had acted fast, pulling the video from the car system and sending it straight up the chain. Now it wasn't just Reynolds' word against Carter's. It was cold, undeniable proof. Reynolds' face drained of color. He had played his hand, but the deck had already been stacked against him. One of the responding officers, now seeing the shift in power, finally stepped forward. "Deputy, turn in your weapon." For the first time that night, Reynolds didn't have an answer. His grip on control had slipped completely, and all he could do now was face the consequences of his own actions. Reynolds' hand trembled as he unfastened his holster, his once firm grip now weak. Slowly, he placed his weapon on the hood of his cruiser, the weight of reality settling in. No more excuses, no more control. The officers who had backed him minutes ago now looked at him with unease, their loyalty shifting as the truth unfolded before them. Sheriff Carter didn't move, didn't gloat. He simply stood there, watching as the system, for once, did what it was supposed to. The damage was already done, but at least this time there was accountability. The officers took Reynolds into custody, leading him to the back of a patrol car. The same seat he had likely forced others into without a second thought. Carter exhaled, the night's tension still thick in the air. He had dealt with men like Reynolds before, but this wasn't just about one man. It was about the culture that allowed him to exist in the first place. Change wouldn't come overnight. But moments like this, where the truth came to light, were steps in the right direction. As the last patrol car pulled away, Carter stood alone for a moment, staring down the empty road. Justice had been served, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet.